institution like the Bank for International Settlements. It could be foreign central banks or it could be foreign governments. It's important to note this because there is quite a bit of aversion to the IMF for the various policies that it has advocated in the past. And studies have shown that the IMF has given wrong advice in many cases, and it has aggravated the problem rather than solved the problem. So, to the extent that there is reservation about dealing with the IMF, you don't want to give away the idea, which is in principle good in itself. So that could be with other institutions. So IMF need not be the only seller of the credit line.
Competition is always better.
Exactly. And even if it is the IMF, and if it is not the IMF, even with the other places, this is an important observation from John F. Kennedy, the President of the United States in the mid-60s. He said this was more in the context of dealing with the Soviet Union then, and Soviet Union or later even China, and a lot of his advisors told him there is no point and there is no need for us to talk to the Soviet Union or China or any of these communist countries. But he had a different opinion. He said that let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us not fear to negotiate. Now, there was a version in the US as far as the Soviet Union and China were concerned, but despite that, you are considering your own interest, and in that enlightened self-interest, you say that, well, what am I afraid of? At the most, the negotiation doesn't work out and we will not agree, but to say that we will not negotiate at all is not a good way of thinking. So, a similar thing here. The US government is powerful, the IMF is powerful. Do we fear them? Perhaps there is need, but we could also talk it out. And remember that when there are capital flows, we are the recipients, they are the providers of capital. If they don't have an outlet for their capital here in emerging economies, then they need to invest in their own countries, where the returns are low. So they have a self-interest in themselves for capital mobility, and in fact they have been pressing for it. Now if the emerging economies were to take the view that we will allow the capital flows provided we have a safeguard against sudden outflow, then this is something that is negotiable because there is a mutual interest involved. So if there is a sudden outflow of capital, there is crash in prices of financial assets, the liquidity problem, currency depreciation. In the past, it used to be ex-post analysis and negotiation with the IMF. This was when credit line was not there, but now that the credit line is there, the negotiation and all these things can be done next ante. If there is a sudden outflow of capital, then a credit line can be invoked, and then you can borrow by right. And the seller of the credit line is obliged to lend. And of course, the other thing is that to the extent that these things happen due to panic, and indeed in the East Asian crisis, some seriously argued that though there was some weaknesses in fundamentals, it was also a case of panic amongst the foreign investors in Asia. Now, if a credit line is at stake, then the foreign investors know that when they want to pull out, they will indeed not have a problem pulling out because the central banks of these emerging economies do have a credit line in place. And so it will not be difficult for them to redeem their deposits, etc., in the banks or elsewhere. So it can, with this and this, you actually may not need to use it, need to invoke it in the first place. this can be useful for not just outflows of capital but also inflows of capital. Remember what I was saying in bits and parts in my earlier lectures, that when there is an inflow of capital, then there is currency appreciates instead of depreciating, and you have the dust disease which affects the exports, the industry in the economy, which is also what is bothering many governments in India, which is to say that when you have so much inflow of capital, then that inflow of capital is leading to an appreciated rupee. So consider a scenario in which the FIIs were not bringing in money. Then with that supply of dollars not being present, the price of the dollar wouldn't be what it is today, 53, 54, thereabouts. It would be possibly, I don't know, maybe, just to take an example, suppose it is 60 or 65, then it would be an impediment to exports, it would positively affect the industry. So some economists are worried about the adverse effect of the inflows on the exports and on the industry in India. So the way to deal with that is, I mentioned the tax on certain inflows. Also, when there are too many inflows, you can afford to liberalize outflows. And remember the need for outflows also by the domestic residents. It is diversification. You invest in India and you invest abroad so that all your eggs are not in the same basket.
But there is a contradiction. If your country is experiencing huge amount of foreign inflows, that is almost the time when outflows from your economy are unlikely to happen, because your country must be very attractive. That's a huge amount of inflows are coming. And even your own outflow, even if you liberalize, may not really help very much. Like take example of Switzerland or Brazil or China or some other country which are kind of right now experiencing this problem. It may, to some extent, yes, help, but may not be a very big help. That's not my guess.
No, it can be. It can still be. Why? Because consider an investor in New York who has invested primarily in the US. Okay. Now, at the margin, there is a small relative to his endowment that he invests here. So, again, the objective can be diversification. Now, in India, we say that, well, the foreigners are coming, so it must be a good place to buy. And so, why should I invest in New York when a New York fellow is coming here? But remember the diversification argument, which is that, all right, India is a good place to invest in, but do I invest all my money in India? There is always a rationale for some money outside. So even if the New York people are investing in India, at the same time it can make sense for Indians to invest some of their money outside.
No, because that is the context of India. But if you take an example of the countries I referred to, say Switzerland or Brazil and all, where there is no restriction as such already on the outflows, which means the diversification is already in place. So by liberalizing further, is it going to be really anything better? I am a little kind of doubtful. That's what I'm just.
By the way, the home bias is not just in case of India. Even in countries like Brazil and so on, it is not to the same degree that we have in India. But home bias is an international phenomenon, and it applies even to US and Europe. Even they are not adequately diversified. So now, if the sudden inflow stops, then the RBI can sell foreign currency gradually, and they can do so without worrying about sudden outflows. Why? Because with the credit line in place, you don't have to worry about this part. So that's where a credit line helps also in taking care of the sudden increase. There is some cost to this, but the cost need not be high because it's for period that we are talking about. Okay. So this is MSS Market Stabilization Scheme, MSS bonds. Are you familiar with this? Okay, so let me talk a bit about this. So consider the RBI balance sheet. So you have the liabilities and the assets. The liabilities are currency reserves. So this together is the high-powered money in the economy. And here you have government bonds, foreign exchange reserves, which you can take as foreign government bonds. And you have some gold. When there are inflows of capital, then what we are talking about here is to prevent the appreciation of the rupee, which can hurt exports. You would like to buy more and more of foreign currency when there is inflow. If you buy more and more of foreign currency, then you may need to increase your base money. That is one way of handling this whole financial operation. You have to match the two sides of the balance sheet.
Even when the inflows come, the same thing you have to do.
With the inflows, so with the increase in foreign exchange reserves, the money supply may need to be increased, but there can be danger of inflation. The US is a different kind of situation which I talked about earlier, but here an increase in base money can lead to inflation. So what you do is sterilization. So with sterilization, the idea is that this side should remain constant, and instead there is an increase in foreign exchange reserves and a decrease in government bonds. Again, you can maintain the quality in the balance sheet. So another way to put it is that you are financing the acquisition of foreign exchange reserves by selling government bonds. That is what the RBI would do. Okay. So if there are inflows month after month and you need to keep increasing this and keep reducing this, then a point can come where you have depleted all your government bonds. Once that stage comes and this is completely gone, it's not there, and you don't want to touch the gold bit, then you can't carry on with the acquisition of foreign currency at the time of large inflows beyond a point. What do you do then? And this is indeed what happened in the period from about 2003, 2007, thereabouts. During that period, there were large inflows of capital. There was appreciation of the currency, which would have been more if the RBI had not intervened. RBI kept buying the foreign currency and it kept selling the government bonds. Eventually, it was not left with any government bond. That's when these new bonds, so-called MSS bonds, market stabilization, and you can see why it was called so. It was to stabilize the financial markets. So what was the idea? The RBI doesn't have any more government bonds, so the government would issue more bonds and these new bonds which were issued for this purpose were called MSS bonds, market stabilization bonds. And this is a bit of accounting for that. So what did it look like? Bond issued by the government of India, of course, is a liability of the government of India, and it would use, when it is selling those bonds, it would use the money and deposits with the RBI. And what would the RBI do? This is the balance sheet of the RBI. I'm sure only the changes. This is a very stylized and simple version. So, with the deposits of government of India with RBI, we would acquire the foreign exchange reserves. Remember what the problem was? The problem was that you don't want to increase the base money to acquire foreign exchange reserves, and you don't have any more government bonds. But you can acquire foreign exchange reserves with government deposits here. Government deposits with RBI are not a part of the money supply. And what is the government of India doing? It is issuing these new bonds. What is interesting in this whole operation is that if you were to look at public authorities combined rather than look at them individually, then the picture is simple, and that is, if you were to combine these two, then you observe, and this is something that you as students of accounting would appreciate and know better, deposits of government of India are being deposited, these two cancel out. So overall the solution is that you have MSS bonds and foreign exchange reserves. So this is the balance sheet of the public authorities put together. So what was effectively being done was that the government of India was issuing bonds, raising the money and using that money to acquire foreign exchange reserves. But of course, since the foreign exchange reserves are supposed to be held by the central banks, you have that administrative legal arrangement, therefore it is done in a roundabout way. But you could look at this as a fiscal policy operation rather than as a monetary policy operation. The point of all this is that inflows, large inflows of foreign capital, there's a way to handle it. You can stabilize the market.
Small clarification. What about like China and Singapore and Norway? They have something called sovereign wealth funds. How will they be kind of because that's like a foreign asset, not really foreign exchange, which possibly gives you better returns in one way, and then also allows you to park the money in those, and that's becoming a very good feature interesting feature in the Gulf countries also now. All the oil exporting countries, they seem to be now going towards this sovereign wealth funds because having this idle foreign exchange, basically, which is likely to even depreciate, even dollar is depreciating. So it's in a way, new innovative ideas are coming in, which possibly are an older idea, but becoming a...
Sovereign wealth funds is not a liquidity arrangement. Foreign exchange reserves are a liquidity arrangement. They have a different role. Here the role of foreign exchange reserves is to stabilize currency market or even stock markets indirectly. Sovereign wealth funds, the purpose is not that. It is more for investment. So you are a rich government, you have funds, and you want to invest profitably and invest abroad. It also gives you diversification and it gives you high return. So it's a standard distinction between liquid asset and usual investment.
Because the countries like which have a huge amount of foreign exchange reserves, since this is very costly, that same game theory example, if I just go back to that you had a high reserve versus the low or medium reserve. So high reserve still might be a kind of a little better strategy, even for say, because then you take care of both these things. You have high reserves, your stabilization issue is not a problem.
Yeah, but
and the problem of the cost which is there, I would be incurring, that also to some extent can be mitigated. Again, I agree that it's more of a diversification tool, but it takes care of both the problems.
No, but wealth funds can be used for liquidity purposes. But the moment they use for liquidity purposes, then they come into the category of foreign exchange reserves and not in the category of sovereign wealth funds. So then it would be a case of high reserves, which is a case of costly reserves. Foreign exchange reserves are costly. So this bit I talked about a little bit last time, so I can skip this, but just to remind you, when we are talking about policy to deal with certain capital flows, then at times there's an argument that let us ban these financial flows because they can be disruptive. The argument here is that they can be disruptive in the absence of reserves and credit lines, but if you have reserves plus credit lines, then they need not be disruptive, and some of the arguments are for very different reasons. They are not really relevant in the context of banning or allowing capital flows. So here is what I'm talking about. If IFIN can leave suddenly and stuff, then it is indeed difficult to borrow, but then that is the situation that you want to confront by ex-ante buying credit line from the foreign governments or foreign banks or foreign financial institutions, just as firms do. Firms have standing credit lines from banks. So similarly, the central banks need to do that from other financial institutions. It's liquidity management. Another way to explain all this is liquidity management. So this could well be a class of international banking rather than capital flows, the economics of capital flows.
This idea is still kind of how many countries at the moment in your data analysis something have credit line? Do you have any?
Three.
Only three.
Only three. It's new, which is why I'm spending some time. But anything new to begin with would have very few buyers. Anything new would have. In 1910 or so, when Ford came out with cars, how many people want cars? Now, if Ford were to begin his analysis by deciding whether or not to set up a car manufacturing plant by asking, let me look out of the window and see how many people have cars, and he would have found that nobody has a car. Now, by that argument, he would have never set up that manufacturing plant, and we wouldn't have known the automobile industry. So, is a credit line somewhat similar? I don't know. Maybe not. Automobiles, of course, exports has been a huge success. But all I want to say is that quantitatively it may be a much smaller thing, but it is important, and as of now, it is, of course, small.
No, but in a way, let me put this problem completely differently. If any country is going for a credit line, in a way, isn't it kind of some kind of admission that I am going to be in trouble?
Not necessarily. Why? Because suppose you and I go to a bank and say that, well, I would like to apply for a credit card. Why would I apply for a credit card? Well, I need money. But by saying that I may need money, am I admitting that I am in financial trouble? I am just taking a preventive measure. So it need not be taken as in fact it can be taken as a positive signal. Why? I have thought through the whole process. I may get into an emergency situation. I may need funds, and I am taking a preventive measure. So I am a responsible person. It can be a positive feature rather than a negative feature. Yeah. This is some data for the 3 countries which have bonds, and you can see it's 2009, so it's recent. And this is some macroeconomic data for these countries, and if you look at the fiscal deficit or the rating, when you take it in its entirety, then you don't find that the credit line is being sold only to some country like Singapore or to some country like Switzerland, which has the best of fundamentals. You have countries like Mexico, Poland, Colombia. So what this indicates and what this suggests is that there is a competition on the part of seller of credit line. And there is one figure here, upfront fee, 6. This is 24 to 27 basis points. So that is the fee that you need to pay per annum to have that facility to meet that situation. Now, the studies of East Asian crisis have shown that the costs of the financial crisis are huge. So, in that context, in that perspective, this fee is rather small if it can be used as a preventive measure.
0.2 is the 1/4%. Is that the
24 to 27 basis points? Yes, 1/4%. So if I want to have the facility to borrow $100, then it says that I pay 25 cents as a fee.
On the amount borrowed, or it's a kind of
on the coverage that I would like to have. I may or may not borrow. In fact, none of these 3 countries have invoked the credit line. This is like a credit card. You hold a credit card, you may hold it for months together without using it. For those of us who are conservative and don't want to use it, but still want to have the facility, just in case.
No, but suddenly, suppose I actually use it, and then will that upfront fee suddenly go up? Since there is no evidence to suggest.
No, that fee, for the renewal of the contract, in case the fundamentals have become weaker, it may. But these are early days, one doesn't know. There is not much of experience to go by.
So this is 2009 data. Are there any updates in we are now 2013?
There are. I haven't got them here. These contracts have been renewed. But the sense I have is that there are similar contracts.
It's like insurance, I think.
It is like insurance.
It's like insurance. And insurance policy, I think, whatever little bit I know, is that if your policy is bleeding, then your charges go up.
Sure, that's possible. That could.
Then the cost as a whole would be needs to be accumulated according to that. And
sure. But what I would say is that this cost needs to be compared to the alternative, which is foreign exchange reserves.
Yes.
And if foreign exchange reserves are even more costly to hold, then there's a case for credit line, even though there is some expense to borrow. So, a bit on the literature on capital flows, and particularly in the context of capital, in the context of credit lines. Now, in 1997-98, the East Asian crisis happened, and very quickly there were 2 important writings. One was Tony Roderick from Howard University, and it was Jagdish Mandoli from Columbia University. And in both the writings, it was said that free capital mobility is not a good idea. Now, one just wishes that these writings had appeared before the crisis. In hindsight, everybody is wiser. But more important than that, and what I want to stress is that, and also state this a little later, in all these writings, if you read line by line, you look at the index, you search for it, the credit line is completely missing. Now, suppose the facility of credit line is not there at all, and foreign exchange reserves are very costly, What is the policy prescription? Capital mobility is not a good idea. That is absolutely true. But the crucial assumption being made there is that the credit line is absent. It was indeed absent, but then the analysis could have been that since you have a problem, therefore a credit line is required, which is what Stanley Fischer did. So Stanley Fischer writing was very different from Roderick and Bharwati Institute. Now, coming more to
Fisher's paper, Stanley Fisher is also around the same time.
It's about the same time. It was published a little later, but of course he kept talking about it at the IMF and elsewhere in a number of places. So he had become an IMF man. And remember, immediately after the crisis, there was one person you didn't want to listen to, which was the IMF. So that was the context.
The reason also was very clear that the IMF, the entire prescription, what IMF was there to cut down the fiscal deficit, and that put the economy into deeper problem in East Asian countries.
That is absolutely true. And if there is aversion to IMF, it is for good reasons. In 97, 98, they came to help, but in many cases they aggravated the problem. They asked governments to cut down government spending. Now that didn't have anything to do with the nature of the problem then. What they had in mind was the first generation currency crisis model. Remember earlier I discussed first generation, second generation and third generation currency crisis model. So they were using a lot of outdated economics and applying it wrong. So the IMF has made its mistakes. That is the very bad part. The good part is that in recent years they have changed their view and changed it openly and categorically. They have now come out in favor of capital controls under some conditions, and also they are offering this facility.
Because the same thing is now kind of being contextualized, discussed in the all these European countries, Greece and all. The prescription seems to be exactly the same. I mean, we don't seem to have learned anything. I mean, despite all those crises in East Asia, IMF getting bad name. Again, IMF and European Central Bank are doing exactly the same thing in Greece and asking the government to cut down the expenditures, which basically means your unemployment rate in many of these European countries is about 50%, which is worse than a depression, basically.
That's true. This was in the context of current account deficits and capital flows. So I'm not saying that the IMF has corrected itself in every matter. In the context of capital flows, capital controls, credit lines, there has been a change. So, coming to writings in India, there are a whole lot of writings, but a credit line is absent in all of them, including all the reports of the RBI. So, I'll skip this Stanley Fisher that I was talking about. That's an important critical writing. Now, one may ask, why is the credit line missing if it is so good and so important? One argument is that the policymakers are not going to accept it anyway. If as an economist you anticipate that this is not going to be acceptable, then you say that why should I, tie myself talking about it. Now, there is an old lesson from the 1950s. Phil Group had a paper in American Economic Review, and he was saying that the title of the paper was Realism in Economics, Realism in Policy at Fauser. So what he was saying was that if you start being realistic on what is going to be accepted, then what you are doing is you are anticipating the mind of the decision maker, and effectively what you are doing is to suggest what is likely to be accepted, what he has in mind. So you are reversing the whole process of advice. It should be your economics giving views, and then of course, depending on political considerations, they may accept or may not accept. But if as economic advisors people start anticipating, then it defeats the whole purpose of economic advice. Another is from this paper, I think in Poonam, is that, at the moment it's 3 countries which have bought a credit line from the IMF. If this was to get extended to a large number of emerging economies, then the IMF may not be able to handle this situation. Now, firstly, we haven't reached that situation, so in that sense it's not very relevant or appropriate. But the other bit is that if there are too many countries wanting it, then I'll explain how that can be dealt with.
They are not needed at the same time.
No, but in a systemic risk crisis,
they may
all needed at the same time. So this is another bit. Now this might surprise you, even shock you. But this is an important thing, and let me read this out. Fashion is the great governor of this world. It presides not only in matters of dress and amusement, but in law, physics, politics, religion, and all other things of the various kinds. What this is arguing is that even when it comes to economic ideas, or rather political ideas, there are some things which are in and some things which are not in at any point of time. What determines that is difficult to say. Let me give you an example. In the 1950s, just about everybody believed in planning. Around 1980s, just about everybody believed in markets. Now, it is not that the theory and evidence has changed so much. Of course, they have been changed. So, one was in response to theory and practice. The experience of Soviet Union, China, and so on led to a change. But that doesn't entirely explain why there was a change. It's a harsh term, but it's a fad, it's a fashion at any point. In the 1920s, you ask somebody what should be the economic policy be, or we should be a planned economy, we should not be a chaotic economy. A market economy is a chaotic economy. It should be a mixed economy, and so on. And then you have a swing to the other side. Why am I saying this? A credit line is not the in thing at the moment. So one simple reason could just be that it is not the in thing. So it's out of the picture. This is an insight long ago, maybe between 1745. And mind you, this was said in the days when electronic media and internet was not there. You can well imagine how powerful this insight is in more recent times with the influence of the internet and the media. There was also an influence of Bhagwati and Rosbeck. These were early writings, and in a sense they set the agenda for research and teaching. So this is for different kinds of credit lines that you can have. What I've talked about here is a credit line from the IMF to the central bank of the emerging economy. Now, I understand that there is some legal administrative bit, and it may require that the finance ministry buys the credit line rather than the central bank buys the credit line. But that's a matter of detail. You can cite the public authorities in the emerging economy. So that is the kind of credit line that we have talked about. This is another one, and this is indeed what has been used in the recent financial crisis. So I take back what I said, that only 3 countries have used credit lines. 3 countries have taken a credit line from the IMF. But if you include the credit lines that have come into being due to the financial crisis, then the number of countries is much larger.
Norway also, Switzerland also comes in here, huh?
Yes. It's swap. So it's not clear if Switzerland was keen or it was the US which was keen. So here, observe it is two-way arrow. So it's a swap credit line. So it is the US government or the US Fed gives a credit line to the Swiss authorities, and the Swiss authorities give a credit line to the US Fed.
This seems more like a monetary policy coordination among the developed countries.
In fact, I'm glad you said that. In fact, one way to interpret the so-called coordination of monetary policy is to view it as an implicit credit line. So, and one way to interpret this lecture here would be to say that let us shift from these understandings and these implicit credit lines, which may or may not get used, and then every time you are negotiating, you are transacting and you are holding meetings at G20, G7, etc. Instead, what you do is institutionalize it, make it explicit. So this is another form that it takes, and this has been more recently suggested. Oscar, it's interesting. Oscar is a very well-known name, and his writings attract a lot of attention. But when it came to talking about this aspect, that is a paper which is not well-known. This was written at the Bank of Japan when he was visiting there, and what also what they were arguing was that here you can have a problem between two central banks. Instead, what you do is that you use the IMF as the mediator between the central banks, so that there is no direct transaction between the central banks. I think let me stop here.